Just because an animal is declared extinct doesn't mean it couldn't still be out there. I know firsthand. For years, I traveled the world searching for previously thought extinct species, and my team and I have found 8 animals the world thought were lost forever. So in this video, I'm going to give you 7 more extinct species that I believe are still out there. And maybe by sharing this information, someone, somewhere, watching this might be able to find them. Starting with our first species, which, if rediscovered, would be the largest gecko on the face of the earth. Number 1, Delcourt sticky-toed gecko, last seen in 1870 and lost for 154 years. In 1986, in the basement of the Marseille Museum of Natural History, a primitive specimen of large gecko was found stuffed, unlabeled, and lacking any record of its collection date or its point of origin. Judging from the specimen, it must have been there for over a century. Once examination of this specimen was performed, it was found to be a species unknown to science. This specimen consisted of a single skin and a partial skeleton. But get this, the skin was stuffed and mounted on a wooden plank, and when mounted, it measured 2.5 feet long. This meant this unique specimen of gecko was 54% larger than the largest known extant species of gecko on the planet. Closer examination of this specimen showed that this gecko was similar to the brown forest geckos, Hypolodactylus species of New Zealand. This puzzling specimen was in fact the lost kawikiwau, a giant and mysterious forest lizard of Maori oral tradition. Described by the Maoris as being about 2 feet long and as thick as a man's wrist, it is the largest of all known gecko species. Gigarcanum delcourti, the scientific name, was likely extinct or extremely rare by the time of colonization of New Caledonia in the mid-19th century, due to the absence of any other records of the species. So all of a sudden, with this museum specimen in the bag and this revelation, in April 1990, several sightings of a large gecko were reported in New Zealand newspapers, but it seemed as though these reports were the end of the excitement for the Delcourt sticky-toed gecko. Until recently. Frank Fast and his partner Philippe de Fessol believe they know the exact hiding place of the extant Delcourt sticky-toed gecko, down to the exact tree. That's right, they believe that there is one specific tree in the middle of Maori country in remote New Zealand that under the bark is hiding the world's largest extinct giant gecko. According to Frank, this species is found to occur in the bark of a handful of different tree species. 2 of them, Podocarpus totara and Agathis australis, I don't know my trees that well, are trees that the animal would prefer. It's semi-arboreal and will be found under the bark of these trees deep in Maori country where no other herpetologist has ever looked. The same kind of area the last 2 specimens of gecko were discovered in New Zealand in 1981 and 1984. Really not that long ago. A gecko the size of a small dog that could be living in New Zealand. Given the history of these 2 experts' discoveries of other giant geckos like the New Caledonian, I'm going to give this one a 9 out of 10 chance of still being out there. Next up, we'll look at a missing dinosaur fish, whose relatives have been mistaken for the Loch Ness Monster himself. Sturgeon are the modern-day equivalents of dinosaurs, making this mini sturgeon one of our last links to the dinosaur age. Syr Darya shovelnose sturgeon was last seen in the 1960s and has been lost for more than 60 years. The Syr Darya shovelnose sturgeon is endemic to the Syr Darya River and was once found in Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. This prehistoric-looking fish is among the smallest species in the world, growing only to about 1 foot long compared to its gigantic 20-foot-long cousins that we get right here in North America. It was once found in the Aral Sea, but according to NASA, the Aral Sea shrunk by more than 60% between 1973 and the early 2000s. Like many sturgeon, this species of fish is fully migratory between fresh and salt water. However, the population was cut off from the Aral Sea where it presumably fed. Back when the Soviet Union was at its highest power, they performed huge water extraction for crop irrigation from the Syr Darya River and the Aral Sea, leading to the Aral Sea drying up to about 1/5 of its former size. So this meant that major habitat loss, damming, and habitat fragmentation are incredibly common in the range, and when you couple that with polluted waterways, these are likely all contributing factors to the demise of this beautiful little sturgeon. So why do I believe it could still be out there? It's likely incredibly rare, but researchers and experts on the subject are hopeful the species remains, just in low numbers. Back in 2016 and twice in 2018, local fishermen reported to researchers that they caught a Syr Darya shovelnose sturgeon. These fish require a moving river for their life history, and I believe the ecosystem remains intact enough to be able to support a small but viable population of these sturgeon if the right kind of surveying and trapping were to take place. And in order to do that trapping, you would have to be able to identify good pieces of habitat that weren't fragmented, that supported the fish's natural history. Then you could go into that region and put out large seine nets to seine for fish. You could put out little box traps, and you could lean into the natural history of the fish's life cycle, like we've done with sturgeon populations around the world, to try and pinpoint a location of this fish. I believe that just like the white sturgeon that's been trapped by dozens of dams along the Columbia River that are stuck in places like the Dalles, Oregon, this sturgeon is likely to still be there. So I'm going to give this a 7 out of 10 chance of still being extant. Next up, a beautiful red primate with a coat unlike anything else in the world. Miss Waldron's colobus monkey. Last seen in 1978 in the Ivory Coast and lost for over 45 years, this animal still sits on the critically endangered list. Miss Waldron's red colobus is dangerously close to becoming the first primate to be declared extinct in more than 500 years after repeated failed searches. But if this creature is still out there, we simply cannot let this happen. This species of colobus monkey has a unique red coat and a native range stretching through most of southwest Ghana. Hunting and habitat loss drove their population down to be reduced by up to 80% in the 1970s, and since 1978, not a single individual has been observed in the wild. Sadly, this monkey was frequently and illegally poached for bushmeat with little interference by local governments. Poaching is still a prevalent problem today, and those possible remaining individuals face a struggle from staying hidden from humans, which really sucks because human beings, especially starving ones looking for bushmeat, are really good at finding animals and killing them. But it's not just hunting that's a problem. Habitat destruction has also played a major role in its decline. The Miss Waldron's red colobus is the first primate to be suspected extinct in the 21st century, but there is considerable debate over whether this assessment is indeed correct. And that's why I think it is so important to, at the very least, give an attempt to figure out whether or not this animal is still out there. And there's even a little bit of hope. Although there have not been any confirmed sightings in over 25 years, in 2008, calls of the Miss Waldron's colobus monkey were heard by a team of scientists from the Swiss Center for Scientific Research in the Ehe forest. Along with hearing the calls, a fresh skin from a red colobus was rediscovered from a poacher, along with a tail in 2019. These are very clear indications that at least up until 2019, there were living individuals hanging out in the Ivory Coast. A single skin found in the possession of a hunter near the Ehe Lagoon in southeastern Ivory Coast in early 2002 raised even more hopes that at least one population of Miss Waldron's red colobus still hangs on. But subsequent field work in this region, including several forest reserves and nearby Île Étoile National Park, has yielded no evidence of living individuals. The problem with surveying for primates is their extreme intelligence and arboreal nature, making it so difficult to tell whether or not those animals could still be there. My method for finding them would be to use acoustic audio traps set high in the trees and AI deciphering codes, which can then take those audio recordings, run them through a program, and give you 100% whether or not they're actually picking up Miss Waldron's. Following confirmations of the sounds and knowing the general areas, baits and camera traps would then need to be set out in the treetops to see whether or not these monkeys could be moving through, and if rediscovered, putting in severe anti-poaching protocols, which of course all takes massive amounts of resources that likely the Ivory Coast doesn't have. So it's not the best situation, and given that even the most recent confirmations were over 20 years ago, and the population and bushmeat hunting in Western Africa has only gotten worse, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm sadly going to give this about a 6 out of 10 of being rediscovered. Whew, man, it's tough to remember all this. I'm glad I have this magic mind. Helps me stay pretty sharp. Oh, and it tastes good. Next up, a lost catfish so oily that you can use it as a torch. The fat catfish, last seen in 1957 in Colombia, has been lost for 66 years.
Yet hope remains that it could still be out there. What's so unbelievably cool and unique about this fish is that it possesses extensive rings of fatty adipose tissue surrounding its body, making it the only freshwater catfish in the world with these features. Well, why is that interesting? In fact, this oily tissue makes it so greasy and fatty that it's sometimes referred to as the grease fish, and locals from the area used to impale it on a stick and set it alight and use it as a torch because it had so much fat and oil in its flesh. That's absolutely insane for a tiny little catfish. The fat catfish is only known from 10 specimens and was last seen in 1957. Researchers know next to nothing about the size, the biology, the feeding habits, or the growth of this unique species. So why did it disappear? Well, one possibility for the disappearance of the fat catfish is trout farming on the lake. In 1936, 100,000 rainbow trout eggs imported from North America were released into the lake. Cecil Miles, the man who first described the species, claimed this would cause the extinction of the catfish. He literally predicted the extinction of the catfish, and still they went ahead with it. Trout farming was originally an economic project promoted by the liberal government in Colombia during the 1930s. And, in fairness, it's still a source of income for many local families. The problem is, trout are voracious predators of smaller fish, which ultimately proved problematic for our fat catfish. So given that there are now trout in this lake and trout are voracious predators, why is it that I think that the fat catfish could still be out there? Well, even though trout were introduced to Lake Toda, they haven't completely overrun the lake like we see with other invasive species. In fact, researchers typically only see trout in particular areas, which has also made it less clear if trout actually had anything to do with the disappearance of the catfish in the first place. Now, thanks to trout's ecology, we know that trout don't live in super deep water. But catfish often do. Ichthyologists even think that the fat catfish may live in the deepest part of the lakes, meaning it's possible that the two species could actually coexist in the lake. In addition to this, a social research team learned from Lake Toda locals that the fat catfish was never common to begin with. I believe it's entirely possible that this lost species could be hiding out in the deepest, darkest pockets of this massive lake, just awaiting its rediscovery, which would have to be done with very crafty, new technology deep water fish traps, which are out there. We just have to figure out what can we use to bait in these fat catfish that isn't going to attract anything else. Well, luckily, we have research teams in Colombia that feel the same. And fingers crossed, it will be soon that we celebrate the rediscovery of the fat catfish. So given that there are already attempts in place, and given that a handful of ichthyologists and myself all believe that the fat catfish could be hanging on in the deepest parts of this high-altitude Colombian lake, I'm going to give this one a 7 out of 10 of the likelihood of still being out there. Next up, we've lost one of the world's only flying mammals, but maybe, just maybe, it's hanging on by a thread on a remote island in New Zealand. The New Zealand greater short-tailed bat, last seen in 1967 and lost for 56 years. Quite often, we'll see the introduction of an invasive species lead to the demise of another. And in the case of the New Zealand greater short-tailed bat, we may have evaded that by the skin of our teeth. one of two species of New Zealand's short-tailed bats. This bat is endemic to the island. It was once thought to be the same species as the New Zealand lesser short-tailed bat, before being declared its own subspecies in 1985, after it had already gone missing. Very little is known about the New Zealand greater short-tailed bat's habitat, preferences, and ecology, as there just hasn't been any studies conducted from before it was labeled extinct. They likely roosted in limestone caves, and it may have also roosted in tree cavities. Like many bats, they're thought to feed on invertebrates in the air and in the leaf litter, but also pollen, nectar, and fruits, similar to the closely related lesser short-tailed bat. The New Zealand greater short-tailed bat vanished from New Zealand's North and South Islands following European arrival some 200 years ago. It was subsequently restricted to small predator-free islands until rats were accidentally introduced in 1963. And the species was last seen in 1967, meaning in just 4 short years, rats were able to wipe out the species. Because this bat species spends an unusual amount of time on the ground, it's especially susceptible to rats, and the introduction of invasive species devastated the bat's remaining population. So given that we know rats are all over New Zealand and that they're a problem not just for these bats but native bird populations, why could it still be out there? Well, the last refuge for this bat was Big South Cape and the neighboring Putehuna Island, forgive me if I said that wrong, until rats arrived there. However, the invasive rats have actually been completely eradicated from both islands, and since then, there have been several unconfirmed sightings in both places. And one of those unconfirmed sightings comes to us from 1999, when Misstancia-like, that's its genus, echolocation calls were recorded from Putehuna Island. As a result of this piece of evidence, the IUCN actually changed the status from extinct to critically endangered, despite not having found a specimen. This fueled an expedition that took place in 2009 that failed to recover any evidence of a remnant population, but it still confirmed the eradication of rats on the island. So it's possible that somewhere on Putehuna, this species remains extant, given its unique roosting locations in hard-to-reach areas. For me, the fact that rats had overtaken the island and they had overtaken the mainland, and the only places that these bats could still survive are on these small islands outside of the main island of New Zealand. And anytime you have animals that are confined to a small area like an island, the likelihood that it can be eradicated by a really good climbing invasive species like a rat sort of puts this one lower down on the ranking. Sadly, I'm only going to give this about a 4 out of 10 of being rediscovered. Next up, a deep-sea creature that I so strongly believe is still out there, I tried to rent a submarine to go and find. The bullneck seahorse, last collected in 1997 in Australia, has been lost for 27 years, but isn't listed as extinct. Instead, and this will give you a clue, it's listed as data deficient. This animal is insanely cool to me. We know absolutely nothing about the species other than pure speculation, but it could be the most likely to actually be rediscovered. The only known individuals of this pygmy seahorse were collected off the coast of Eden, Australia, but the bullneck seahorse has never been seen alive in the wild. No information is available about the bullneck seahorse's population density, distribution, its range, its ecology, its behavior, its population trends, its genetic structure, its life history. Nothing. Nothing out there exists because it's a tiny little seahorse that lives down at 325 feet. But based on its morphology, scientists believe it lives in sand beds at the bottom of the ocean more than 325 feet underwater. In fact, it may even be sympatric with Gorgonian sea fans and corals, giving us at least a targeted place to start the search. Visually, it's similar to other pygmy seahorses, except it has a wide neck, a snubbed face, and a small body with a tiny little pectoral fin, hence why the scientific name has the word minotaur in it because of its super large head-to-body ratio. So given this tiny deep-sea seahorse lives in an area where there couldn't possibly be habitat destruction, it has no monetary or food value, why would this creature go extinct? Well, there isn't a reason. There is no cause for extinction. This is the perfect example of a lost species, a species researchers are just not concerned with finding due to its unique range and difficulty in studying because it lives at such depths. This isn't an extinct animal coming back. This is an animal that we barely know about because of how unique it is, endemic to such a small area and so deep, that is literally just lost to science. The fact that the bullneck seahorse has been collected before means it's likely still out there, but because it lives at such extreme depths, it is rarely, if ever, seen. To study and identify this wrongfully labeled extinct animal would require a ton of resources and funding. That's why I looked into getting a submarine to go down and try and uncover the species. It just simply occurs at depths that are out of the range of scuba diving. But that was several years ago. Today, as underwater ROV technologies advance, this could be the perfect way to track down and find this lost species, given the extraordinary costs that we ran into when trying to charter a submarine. So, given where this crazy little seahorse lives, how unusual it is, the fact that it has absolutely no pressure on it from human beings that we're aware of, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm going to give this one a 9 out of 10 of being rediscovered. Our next species is found in one of the most biodiverse regions on the planet, and new species discoveries are coming out of that area at a high rate, leading me to believe there's a really good chance it's patiently awaiting its rediscovery. Except for 1 or 2 individuals imported for the pet trade, Zug's monitor is completely unknown. It's rarely, if ever, seen by locals, and scientists know nothing about its ecology or natural history. If you ask me, that makes it 10 times more intriguing to go out there and try and find. What's interesting is Zug's monitor was originally described from a juvenile museum specimen, which was labeled as Varanus indicus, and at least 1 or 2 specimens resembling the type specimen and generally agreed to represent the species have been imported at various times, but not for scientific collection, not for study. They've been imported for the pet trade. Other than this, the species is completely unknown. Its habits are unknown, and it's not been observed ever in the wild as far as we know. So why could it still be out there? Well, it comes from the Moluccan Islands of East Indonesia, where another very famous extinct creature could still be, the Moluccan barbaroussa, but that's a video for another time. But what's particularly interesting is this exact area, the Moluccan Islands of East Indonesia, is an area where a large number of new varanid, meaning monitor lizard species, have recently been discovered, including many of which are in the same genus as the Zug's monitor. The rainforests of the Halmahera Island are a biodiversity hotspot and home to several endemic species. And because of these recent discoveries, I believe the Zug's monitor is very likely hanging out there as its own endemic species, waiting to be found, waiting to be noosed by a lizard catcher, and rediscovered and put back on the map. Because it is living in such a dense, remote, and frankly understudied area, in a place that has some of the highest species diversity in the entire world, and because it's not really an extinct species, but once again, my favorite, a lost species, I absolutely think that in our lifetime, we are going to see the Zug's monitor be uncovered. I'm going to give this one a 9 out of 10. Well, there you have it. 7 species lost to science that I believe have the chance of being rediscovered. If you guys like this topic of de-extinction, check out some of our other videos on the same topic. Let me know in the comments what species I may have missed, and I may be doing another video on them. And hey, do me a favor, like and subscribe.